This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Everyone has a brain which plays a major role in mental illness. I think everyone is, temporarily or not, a little mentally ill. That's what our next guest is told by a leading psychiatrist whom she meets in Rome in a quest that takes her from a psychiatric ward in Los Angeles to Italy and Bolivia as she tries to come to grips with the effects of lithium, the drug she's prescribed when she's diagnosed at the age of 16 with bipolar disorder. According to the American Psychiatric Association, bipolar disorders are, quote, brain disorders that cause changes in a person's mood, energy, and ability to function. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression.
Well, every year, some 44 million Americans experience mental illness, of which almost 6 million are diagnosed as bipolar. In her remarkable memoir titled Mental, Lithium, Love, and Losing My Mind, Jamie Lowe shares and investigates her experience with mental illness and the drugs used to combat it. She was on lithium for 2 decades, but was forced to go off it when she experienced serious kidney problems as a result of the medication. She points to statistics published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that show the use of prescription medication for antidepressants among all ages increased nearly 400% over the last 2 decades. To talk more about her experience with an illness that's still associated with social stigma, despite affecting tens of millions of Americans, we're joined now by author and journalist Jamie Lowe. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a profound book. Why don't you start off where you first learned, where you first were diagnosed, and talk about your experience at the age of 16 in a Los Angeles psych ward?
Well, it started a little bit before that because I was cycling, and so I was pretty much...
But what does that mean, cycling?
So I was on a manic high, which meant that I was hallucinating. I thought I could talk to Michael Jackson. I thought I knew secret tunnels to Neverland. I was, like, imagining Muppets, and some of it was very... You know, some parts of mental illness are kind of funny. Many parts are horrible, and, you know, I had accused my dad of being physically abusive. He had never been physically abusive. And at this point, you know, I was running away from him. And all of my parents are divorced, so I have like a million parents. But they all had sort of seen this pattern of disarray, mental disarray, I guess, and they had figured out that the adolescent ward at UCLA was the best place for treatment and had sort of taken me to the ER. And so that's where I ended up. But I had to take a lot of antipsychotics. I had to go through a lot before Dr. D'Antonio, who was the head of adolescent care there, diagnosed me. He identified it immediately because the symptoms are so bizarre but all similar.
And how long did you stay in that psychiatric ward?
I was there for about 3 weeks, so the first 3 weeks of my senior year.
And what was your experience there?
It was terrible, and it was also, you know, fantastic because I got better. So the beginning of it, I was very resistant to medications. I was, you know, still hallucinating. I was still delusional. I thought an apocalypse was happening. I thought I was going to be going to war in Nicaragua. There were these enormous pipes outside the window, and it was just the generator of the hospital. But I had this idea that they were poison gas and that it was going to be like another Holocaust and we were all going to die. And that was the bad part. The good part was when I kind of came to the realization that I needed to take the medication.
And the medication was lithium?
Yes.
What did it mean to you that your illness was named? And what did they tell you at the time that you were suffering from?
So that's a really good question. They told me I was manic depressive, which was what it was called when I was diagnosed in '93. It's now called bipolar disorder. To me, it doesn't make a difference. I am what I am, like Popeye. But the label is just a category, and it helps to sort of identify with other people, to know that you're not alone in experiencing everything that's going on, because the symptoms and what's happening is so bizarre. I mean, there are so many things that are just beyond imaginable. And so it's nice to know that those things exist in other people's worlds as well. I mean, like, one thing is extreme religiosity. I'm not a religious person at all. But when I was in the hospital, I was like saying, you know, the prayers I had, the rabbis were visiting me. I was like, you know, really, really into being Jewish and Judaism and like super duper, like celebrating Shabbat. My family is completely not, they're very Reform, and we're not on that trip. But in the hospital, I was extremely religious. So that's something that many people who are bipolar experience. You know, that was one of the few things in the book where I was trying to really find a reason for that, because the symptoms are so bizarre. But that one was sort of like, nope, they just are the symptoms that they are.
Well, while you were in the psychiatric ward, you were kept for a period of time in isolation.
Yeah.
And despite what people may think of that, which is that it's very scary or claustrophobic, it actually helped you. Explain why.
I think that was my breaking point. I think that, you know, in the same way that, and this sounds horrible, but the same way that you break a horse, like, I think that I was just so far gone, and I had been tackled by nurses to take medication at that point. I had been like whispering all of these, you know, conspiracy theories to different patients. I was like a menace to everyone on the ward, and they kind of just put me in this box. And I think, even though it sounds terrible, I just let go of everything and kind of collapsed and realized that I needed to kind of reevaluate, and that was a glimpse of that. I don't think that I was like completely better and it was an aha moment. I was like, okay, great. But I felt calmer. Like I have a distinct memory of like just a little taste of calm.
Can you, because you're a journalist and you've really deeply researched all of this now, and you're so deeply informed by your own personal experience, talk about what the definition of bipolar disorder is, and then also describe how you changed on lithium, what kind of effects it had on you, and in your research and interviews with so many other people who have experienced this, what it meant to them.
Sure. The definition, as I understand it, for bipolar disorder would be that there is a period of manic highs followed by a cycle of depression, and it can either be long depression with one long mania, or it can be like mania, depression, mania, depression. The thing about mental illness is that it's so individual, and everybody sort of has their own, you know, as the symptoms are very similar, but each person really, it's the hardest thing to treat, because it's just your own experience is slightly different from the person next to you, which is why it's really hard to tackle as a national issue. In terms of
medication.
Yes, medication.
And explain what lithium is, and explain what effect it had on you, and why you eventually, after decades, had to give it up.
So lithium's the third element on the periodic table. So it is present in the Big Bang. It's this kind of amazing miracle salt. It also is a metal. It's present everywhere on Earth, in the galaxy, in our bodies, for everyone. So the lithium, for me, when I took it, I didn't actually feel that many side effects. A lot of people feel side effects. A lot of people it doesn't work for. For me, it was kind of seamless. And I think part of the reason it was seamless was because it had to be. I had been experiencing just so much tumult in my life that to have something that kind of evened everything out was good. And I was in my senior year, and I kind of just let go of everything else and was like, okay, this is what's going to work for me, and this is what I have to do, and this is what's going forward I'm going to have to take. That year was really hard just because I was kind of, gave up on high school and friends and everything. But then when I went to college, everything was great, and I didn't really think about it. Lithium was kind of in my back pocket and worked. And then it worked so well, actually, that with my psychiatrist, once I had moved to New York after college, we decided that I could taper down, try life without lithium.
After how long?
I was 25, so it was about
9 years after you'd started it.
So that was not a good idea. Although who was to know, because it could have been an isolated incident.
I mean, so many people describe wanting to experience the highs and lows of life, which is why they go off of it.
Right.
So what did it mean to, quote, taper down in your life?
So I still experience the highs and lows in life in a pretty hyperbolic form, even with lithium. I still get really anxious when there's too much work on my plate. I still am really, really excited about random things that I can't identify, but when happiness comes, it comes and it's great. But when I'm not on the medication, the highs and lows are unmanageable. They're highs that are wearing, head-to-toe glitter and 18 tutus, 16 belts, 30 necklaces, and this crazy, and I can see it when I'm on the subway. Sometimes I'll see someone and I'm like, oh, I recognize that outfit. That looks a lot like something that I would have loved when I was not on my meds.
Well, one of the things that you point out, a part of the reason that this memoir is so remarkable is that, there's still a lot of stigma attached to mental illness. So it took a lot of courage for you to write as you did. And similarly, it's often very difficult for people to accept that they need medication for mental illness. Mm-hmm. You didn't have those problems.
That's true. I can see the stigma and I understand it, and I see it with other people. For me, I come from I think I just have never really had a filter. I don't I haven't. The courage part didn't really even occur to me because I've always talked a lot about being bipolar, and maybe that's because I was diagnosed when I was 16, and it's always been kind of a part of who I am, and describing it is not something that I feel bad about myself for. There are moments, though, when I'm like, please, I don't want to think about medication anymore. I don't want to do this the rest of my life. I don't want to have to. And I think that is a totally natural reaction that everyone who suffers from mental illness sort of has to deal with.
I don't think you described that point where you tapered off and what it meant in terms of what happened to you.
Yeah.
And then when you ultimately had to go off it, which is more recent, because of kidney trouble.
Right. So the tapering off was in 2001. It was in January of 2001. And actually, it was earlier than that. And the manic episode that followed was that winter. And that was I just started acting really weird. And I was actually living only a few blocks from your studio, which was really funny because I just walked by my old apartment. And I quit my job. I was freelancing. I had a job offer. I was like, I don't want to work anymore. I'm going to barter for things. I'm going to just buy Brussels sprouts and squash. And I was sending $700 of squash to neighbors. And one of the things that triggered the really, really bad parts of that episode is that when I was on one of the job interviews that I went on for, I think it was Blender magazine, which was this music magazine published by Maxim and stuff, and my apartment burned down, and it was horrifying, and just this thing that made everything a billion times worse. And it just triggered this really, really intense, It was probably a good 6 months where I was back and forth between New York and LA because I wouldn't stay in LA where my parents were trying to like help me get better. They didn't want to put me into an adult psychiatric care because it was like the circumstances of that are just way beyond getting better even. So I then ended up in LA for 3 months with my family and then came back here, was like pretty depressed for 6 months. It was really, really hard.
And were you self-aware? I mean, since you were working with a doctor, you knew you were tapering down. Did you understand you were in a full manic phase, that this was the effect?
No. So, I mean, I didn't want to know that I was in a manic phase. I was basically like, I'm fine. This is amazing. Everything that's happening is the way it should be. And you guys are all crazy.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion with Jamie Lowe. She's an author and journalist. Her latest book is just out. It's titled Mental: Lithium, Love, and Losing My Mind. When we come back, we'll go from that UCLA adolescent psych ward to the salt flats of Bolivia, where so much of lithium is. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is Jamie Lowe, author of Mental: Lithium, Love, and Losing My Mind. It's a memoir. Nermeen?
Before we go to your trip to Bolivia, which is where most half of the world's lithium is found, I wanted to talk about the fact that in your book you raise the question of the two different traumas that you experienced that what you say triggered your bipolar disorder. Now, there's a lot of debate within the psychiatric community about to what extent this disorder, which used to be known as manic depression, is caused by a chemical imbalance and what's caused by environmental factors. So can you say what role you think trauma plays in this?
It's a really good question because it is controversial and totally unknowable in some ways. I think that it's a factor of both environment and genetics. I think that my family definitely has a history of mental illness. My grandfather on my mom's side comes from a family that has some mental illness in it, and he was sort of late. He was, as an elder person, he sort of had a bout of depression that was pretty serious. But I was molested when I was 13, and I think that a lot of, there was this comprehensive study of research from the past 40 years that basically said that sexual assault victims are associated with mental illness. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it triggers it or that it causes it, but that there is this link between the two things. And I think that there's almost, when I think about my episodes, they sometimes revolve around those types of, like, that trauma is involved in some of my hallucinations. They were involved in some of the things that were kind of the outlandish parts of the way I was behaving, were like manifestations of having been assaulted.
In what sense, though? In what sense would you say that's the case?
I think that, identifying male figures in my life, like my dad, and saying that he had abused me and that abuse actually was coming from somewhere else. Like, he has never abused me. He's been a loving father my entire life and very supportive and trying to understand what all of this is, as all my parents have always tried to do. Because it's not easy. I think, like, when somebody loses their mind and loses who they are and can't function the way that you know them to function on a daily basis, it's really hard to understand that that's not who they are. And I think that so I think the sexual assault actually is part of it. And I think that then each episode is also a trauma in itself, because they're really, really intense, really, really kind of, they sort of shift the way your life moves, and it's like a different narrative then, you know, as if there was a parallel one, what would have happened? Like, I have no idea. Like, this is who I am. This is the way that my life played out. But I think, like, each time something happens, there's like a little bit a part of you kind of shifts with it.
Can you talk about what happened after 20 years when your kidneys were affected and you had to completely go off of lithium, your fears at the time, and what you went on to?
So that was what basically brought on this book, is that I had realized that I had this almost love affair with lithium, like this relationship with lithium that it really helped me function for 2 decades in a way that I never would have had. And that the minute that I had this physical, like, reminder that it wasn't actually 100% good for me, or that it was, you know, eating away at my kidneys, which is not a technical term, that I had to know more about it. Like, I didn't know anything about it as a medication. I didn't really know much about it in its place in the world. And the minute I started investigating it, it was like this miracle drug. Nobody really still knows how it works. And it's been used for millennia. How it felt for me personally was like nothing but distraught and just like complete fear that I would end up manic again because another medication wouldn't work.
And so what did they give you?
So I the first time I tried Depakote, it was just the side effects were really, really intense, and I like was crying all the time, and it was a mess. And this was like the thing I had not experienced with lithium when I was first prescribed it. A lot of people don't react well to medications. It's why mental illness is really hard to treat also. It's why it's hard to get mentally ill people to stay on medications, as the side effects can be really severe. So I was on Depakote. It was really, really hard. I got off of it because I just couldn't deal with it. And I ended up taking another medication, Tegretol, which then it turned out was toxic for my liver. Which was a sort of random thing that my general practitioner found at a routine physical. Thank goodness, or not, whatever. Then I was sort of out of the really good medications for mania. The rest of the medications are more for depression, and I suffer more from mania. So my psychiatrist and I decided that I would try Depakote again. And I tried it, and it was actually like way better. It worked out way better. I was feeling fine. It was okay. And all of the side effects I had felt initially were like there, but way less. So I just sort of assumed they were psychosomatic.
Before we go, we wanted to talk about Bolivia just for a moment. We only have 2 minutes. So can you talk about the journey you took to the place, the land of lithium, where half of lithium is found?
Yes. The journey, I mean, it's like, it's a magical place for me. Like I think for anyone who's there, because it has this kind of moonscape. It feels like you're in a completely different universe where everything is kind of this crystalline green, and you can kind of feel the salt crawling up your body and sort of immersing itself in your pores. And it was like I wanted to just roll around in it and kind of pay homage to this thing that had helped me for so long. It is there. They have these little salt hotels you can stay in the middle of the salar, and they're not really hotels. They're like a cot where you stay near springs that you can soak in, and the water is like really laden with lithium, and you can just sit there with like this steam rising up, and it's a really kind of magical place, I guess.
Well, one of the things that you say in terms of the extent to which lithium is prescribed is that it's not a patented drug.
Right.
So what does that mean in terms of people's access to lithium?
So it's really cheap. People aren't, like, psychiatrists don't prescribe it as much because it's not as marketed by pharmaceutical companies, but lithium is the problem is that there aren't more tests done on lithium for other applications because there isn't a market for it. Like, there's no money to be made. Right. So there are studies that have said that it's good for Parkinson's, it's good for ALS, that it's good in a lot of different ways for brain function besides just treating bipolar disorder.
We have 20 seconds.
Okay.
With the millions of people expected to fall off health care, are you concerned about the mentally ill in this country?
I'm always concerned about the mentally ill in this country because the health care doesn't even cover enough mental illness coverage. Like, it's just, there are, 30% of people in homeless shelters are mentally ill, 24% of people in state prisons are mentally ill. There are a lot of people to be concerned about. We want to thank you for being with us, Jamie, and for writing this book, Mental, Lithium, Love, and Losing My Mind. That does it for today's show. If you'd like to get a copy, you can go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Accepting applications for a paid year-long news fellowship. Details at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Democracy Now! Is our news hour.